Welcome to Political Pandemonium 2020, a series of 4 workshops presented by the Technology and Social Change Research Project at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy of the Harvard Kennedy School. Hosted by Research Director Dr. Joan Donovan, these sessions explore the harmful effects of media manipulation on our society. Our first workshop, entitled What Does It Mean to Protest Today? Media Manipulation and the Movement for Black Lives, features Dr. Donovan in conversation with Dr. Alondra Nelson, President of the Social Science Research Council, and Thabisile Griffin, doctoral student in history at UCLA and activist in Los Angeles. We hope you enjoy the video.
I want to say welcome everybody to the first in a series of very small workshops that we're doing through Shorenstein called Political Pandemonium 2020. The reason why we decided to go with this format and have you submit a small application to be part of it was so that we could have a much more granular conversation and be a little bit more interactive throughout the course of the next 90 minutes. I think that in this moment, especially as the tech hearings are kicking off, that it's probably more important than ever that we start to pay attention to the relationships between protest, the pandemic, and politics as this perfect storm comes together and most of us are living still under these soft quarantines and are anticipating a much longer pandemic experience. Nevertheless, as we embark on the next 90 minutes together, I understand that some of you will need to jump in, some of you might need to drop off, and that's okay. For the first 45 minutes, we're going to be having a dedicated discussion about political pandemonium, and we have 2 guests who are going to help us through the discussion. One is Alondra Nelson, who is now the president-elect in 2 years from now for the social science, the Society for the Study of Social, this 4S. There are 4 S's and they include studying science and society. I should know that because I've been a paying member for a decade now. But also Alondra's career has really inspired me as a scholar, as someone that studies science and technology. She's currently the president of the Social Science Research Council and is at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies, has published numerous texts on genetics and the impact of genetics on society. But one of her earlier books that has really it appeared in nearly every class that I've taught is about the ways in which the Black Panther Party sought to create networks of health clinics in the midst of, again, a very different historical circumstances, but nevertheless urgent need for people to get access to care in their communities and to have it be within their own terms. The other participant in the discussion is Thabisile Griffin, who is a graduate student at UCLA, who in your email invitation, you will have gotten her bio, but that is the short list of amazing accomplishments that she's been able to undertake as a graduate student studying history and colonization, race, and hierarchies, but particularly looking at patterns of resistance and I hate the word uncovering or even discovering, but going back in through archives, remaking archives, reinterpreting literatures is so that we can know more about the ways in which people make up everyday insurrections. And so I've been very blessed to know both of these scholars throughout my career, and I'm very excited for us to have this conversation together. Just gonna pull up my questions that I made. But before I do that, I would love to have Thabisile and Alondra go over just a bit about this present moment and describe what you've been thinking about, just in very general and broad terms, the stuff that's going on right now. What's front of mind for you, and what have you been paying attention to? And we'll start with Alondra.
Thanks, Joan, for that introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to be in conversation with you and Thabisile, who I've not met before. So I'm glad to meet you and to know you, and to be in conversation with all of you here. Thank you for being here. So, gosh, what's front of mind? I mean, really thinking about collapse and failure, about collapse and failure of the stories that we like to tell ourselves, are kind of rosy-eyed, sort of eyeglass stories about quote unquote America, about quote unquote democracy, about racial democracy, and I think coming face to face with where we really are as a national community, and all of the violence, the failures, and the sort of hope and social movements that have, for good or not, got us to this place. So I really have been quite thinking about faltering and failing and starting again and trying again, and also have been thinking a lot about what it means in this moment in which a global pandemic has really crystallized some of these failures, have brought them into kind of the really bright light, and just such stark relief that one cannot deny them, cannot ignore them. And how do we sort of, think about that, and what do we want to do next? And then, of course, I've been thinking about, as I always am, about social movements and about, Black people's movements in particular, that, sort of times good and bad, are always there as just a source of power, resilience, as a paradigm for how to try to find a way out of moments that have been as troubling and uncertain as this one, time and time again.
Thank you. Thabisile?
Yes. And it's wonderful to meet you, Alondra. I'm such a big fan of your work. So I'm very happy to be here and here with you, Joan. Gosh, this moment is such like an incredible and devastating culmination of world events. I mean, I don't think anybody could have predicted it. And I think that's what makes it partly so wonderful, in a sense, of course, notwithstanding the devastation that's hit us in so many ways. But I myself, as somebody who is on social media, and as somebody who I think is considered kind of like an older millennial, perhaps, I've been paying attention to that. I've been paying attention to social media, as you two are experts on, and the dual nature of quick information. And so with my work, I do work on the 18th century Caribbean. And I think a lot about, like, Julia Scott has a magnificent study on like Caribbean networks of communication, where like different islands in the Caribbean would, or Black people or indigenous people on the islands would spread information about insurrections or about different things of that nature through seaway channels, through newspapers, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm thinking like that kind of represents that era's quick information era. So we're now contending with meme culture, right? And so, being the indignant scholar that I am, I'm over here flipping through memes and thinking about how they're both very frustrating and very useful. They're frustrating in a sense that they're flat. They tell a very flattened story. They oftentimes flatten and simplify things that we take years to think about, learn about, comb through, and that we feel is necessary to know to exact like material change, but they're also super useful because everybody and anybody has access to them, and it's quick. You know, under capitalism, even during a pandemic, people don't have time. People have to take care of their kids, and people have many more stressors now that we're dealing with COVID-19. So I've been thinking about that, the dual nature of social media information and social justice information and political education and historical education, all done through memes. And then I've also just been very grateful to see it all, you know. At the end of the day, it's been such a crazy turn of events. It's been such a plot twist to have both a pandemic and an ongoing uprising, that it's just presented a moment for me where I'm also on Twitter, and I get frustrated a lot because people are also recycling a lot of this quick information and these hot takes and stuff like that. And sometimes we might feel as scholars like the wrong things are coming to light. But then I've also come into sense, as a historian, my own responsibility. Like, this is our time to really do what we say we're supposed to be doing. Like, and not to give all of us the onus, you know, or all of us in academia the onus, but I have had to check myself. Instead of getting frustrated with a lot of popular opinion, I see it as a failure of historians in a good way. Mm-hmm. And it propels me to think about different ways that I can reach people, or we can reach people, or we can hand out, you know, comprehensive book lists or things of that nature. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what I could think of on the top of my head.
Yeah. No, I think Alondra might agree with me too, is that I'm not a failure of historians, but also sociologists have had a long time to get this right and to get this information out there. And we're still struggling with the basic narratives about what is a good definition of racism or structural racism, bigotry, prejudice. How do you know the difference? And what kind of conversations come about when you don't have the same frames, right? When you're not showing up with the same definition of the problem. And one of the things that I think is really salient going on with the Black Lives Matter protests in particular is that journalists, politicians, technologists, and even activists all have different interpretations of the situation, especially right now, as there's a struggle over who gets to represent which piece of the movement. So Thabisile, I want to go back to you and ask you just sort of to give us a heads up of what's going on in LA, because I know that from the perspective of people who do organizing, you know, sort of first in your heart is to want to communicate to the broader public, but then to get the work done means you got to be going place to place. I know that you've been working like through these mutual aid networks, making sure that people have access to food and pharmaceuticals and things that they need. And so if you could just give us a sense of, like, from your perspective, what's going on in a place like LA, and you know, what might that, like, what kind of contradictions come about when, you know, Garcetti or you know, the LAPD are trying to define the situation for you?
Right. Well, in my very limited perspective, we'll say, LA's on fire, regardless of what's popularized through the media. LA's on fire. It's been consistent. And I say this in a figurative way. Sometimes it's literal, but for now it's figurative. So BLM LA has been working on a defund the LAPD campaign. And to my knowledge, they meet weekly. They're holding actions weekly. They're meeting with politicians. They're gaining solidarity with politicians, with other groups. It's intergenerational. And they have a list of demands, and they also have like a chart that shows where the money should go to within the community. So it's very well thought out. It's a very well thought out strategy and plan and objective, and I'm happy about it. I'm excited about it. So BLM LA is doing that. throughout this country, we've seen mutual aid pop up like never before. I mean, mutual aid has always been happening, particularly in a lot of like Black, queer communities, just in housing and food and stuff like that. And trans communities, mutual aid has always been there, of course, but people don't call it that because it's not popular. But mutual aid in an even broader sense has been popping up tremendously, which is wonderful. So me and a comrade of mine started up a mutual/mobility aid organization, and we deliver groceries for free. We find volunteers throughout the city to deliver groceries for free to people that are elders, immunocompromised, or single mothers. Basically folks who are more vulnerable to COVID complications if they were to be exposed to it or contract the virus. And it's wonderful. We have over 300 volunteers. And these are just regular random people that we didn't know before all over the city of Los Angeles that are ready to drop everything and go grocery shopping for people that they don't know. So in essence, when I say LA is on fire, I mean people are seriously reckoning with the possibilities of different ways of relating to each other. And just beyond reckoning, they're actually carrying it about. So they're living through it. I know that a host of a lot of youth organizations are popping up. Youth Justice Coalition is not new, but they're thinking of different ways to imagine like police-free cities, worlds without the police, or abolitionist spaces, worlds without prisons and stuff like that. So everybody has these objectives at the forefront of their mind, and they're really pardon me, my head is a little foggy. they're really trying to think about it. So yeah, LA is doing great. There's so many organizations, Joan, but those are like, those are some that I could think of at the moment. And it's wonderful and it's consistent. I just want to stress that, like, regardless of what's popularized and what's trending throughout the media, these people are still working and meeting and organizing and gathering and mobilizing every single week. So I think that's really important to remember, because a lot of people try to historicize these moments as spontaneous or isolated, when in reality, people have been working before this moment and they'll be doing it afterwards in different ways.
No, and back when I lived in LA, 2011, 2012, it was just iterative, as situations happened, people iterated and tried to meet with one another and to meet each other's needs. And I know the police accountability movements in LA have been going strong since way before I was there, and continuing in that tradition.
Absolutely.
But, and I wanted to, go on.
Sorry. Well, I just wanted to say, I think what's specific to this moment is that everybody's moved beyond police accountability into defunding as a leg of police abolition. So it's like defunding for now, but the main objective is to render them unnecessary, is to create our communities in such a way that we don't need them. And that's at the forefront of so many organizations right now, which is crazy, because before people were like, oh, that's a rosy idea, Sorry. That's all.
It's good. But Alondra, I wanted to get your reaction to that, especially in light of the fact that you've been studying this for so long and know the history so well of how communities in different places have had to network and coordinate, by and large, to make up for some of the fissures caused by the state and police, and then also by the deficits in the way in which different kinds of inequalities materialize as a result of our institutions being structured through these hierarchies, and particularly with violence and surveillance being at the core of policing. And so I was hoping you could respond a bit to what you've been hearing.
Sure. Thank you. I wanted to just make a plug at the Social Science Research Council. We've been running these short interviews with leading scholars about this moment, people trying to wrap their heads around this moment. And we have one that will run tomorrow with Dr. Kelly Lytle Hernandez, in which she, who's a historian at UCLA, and talks very powerfully about the Black Lives Matter movement in Los Angeles. And one of the points that that she makes is, that the sort of Black and queer communities that have been mobilizing and BLM have for, every week for the last 6 years been protesting and been engaging the Los Angeles Police Board of Commissioners. And so, there are moments when movements come into vision, come into perspective for kind of the broader community, but the work is really ongoing, and that's a perfect example of that. And I hope folks will look for that conversation tomorrow when it goes online. But I would also say that the LA case really is in microcosm, sort of what Black movements in particular have always done. I mean, so one of the reasons, we often use we'll use the phrase movement for Black lives to really sort of encapsulate more than, BLM formally as an organization or as a sort of network of organizations to take it all in capaciously. But I think, one could also make the case that a movement for Black lives really refers to like the whole, centuries long kind of trajectory of Black people's fights for freedom over time. And so that is, for me, I think the thing that we don't want to get lost in this movement, that it's just always been, always taking place, whether it's popular, whether it's not popular, and moreover, and under more challenging conditions when, it's not popular, when it's reviled, when like the reaction to Black movements has been like total annihilation of communities of activists. And so in the face of that, here you have this tradition that we might, using today's parlance, call the movement for Black lives, that, includes people like, people sort of like Maroons during, who, resisted captivity and enslavement. You might think of, Ida B. Wells. I mean, there's a whole kind of trajectory of work that one could think about there. And so, and I also think that it's important to sort of remember that these are not only kind of long going, but also really multifaceted, movements, that, the BLM sort of platform alone is just, capacious. It's really kind of all of the kind of pillars and things that not just Black people, all people need for like a full and thriving kind of life and living. And, and is a kind of extraordinary vision in that regard. So that they're, that they include a whole lot. And so I think if one kind of comes to the space of thinking about political movements with understanding their longevity, the fact that they overlap, in the social science literature and the sociology literature, there's a phrase called social movement spillover, and which it sort of empirically in the literature really follows people moving from sort of second wave feminism to Greenpeace and these sorts of things. So there's sort of actors you could follow, but all you would have to do is sort of read a few books in the 20th century history of a movement or two movements in the US to see how much this work kind of really is overlapping struggles. And even as those of us, who are not in a movement might see them as really discrete and having nothing to do with each other, NAACP, reproductive justice movement, right? If you look at the kind of social networks of the lives of the organizers and the activists and the things that they're asking for, they're really all of a piece. And I think that's important to remember about Black movements as well. And then I wanted to bring in, the sort of context of the contemporary, of the pandemic. And, I have really resisted the kind of two pandemics language, sort of, COVID on the one hand and, movements against anti-Blackness on the other. In fact, because, if one looks closely at, Black freedom movements, the sort of failures that we're facing around COVID-19 in the United States in particular are failures around the basic things that people need for their lives, right? And so it's not, on the one hand, there's a way in which the introduction of this new viral, as somebody also who studies science, I am also quite captivated in the fact that there's a virus is a living thing, and it is like trying to live its life, like trying to live its best life, as we all are. It happens to be the case that its best life will kill us. It will kill us. So, so some of us. And so, you know, I want to understand that as we're talking about racial health disparities, as we're talking about the failures of our public health system, of our hospital infrastructure, that the sort of foundations and things that a lot of movements have been asking for a very long time are the things that would have made the introduction of our new viral companion into our world a lot different and less kind of catastrophic and fatal for many of us. And so, you know, I think there's poetry to the two pandemics language, but that the fundamental issues around what is making COVID-19 you know, what is making it have disparate impact in the United States and certain communities, and also particular impact in the United States after we have really undermined our social safety net, after we have undermined kind of common good investments into institutions and other things, are these bigger kind of structural issues that have always been in the purview of movements for Black lives.
Yeah, and so I want to pick up on that thread and then get a little nerdy with history because I'm here to learn. And you know, are there things that you've studied in the past in the histories that you've uncovered that might have led to, if we had followed that track, like led to an alternative present, right? I'm thinking here about if we had taken the charge up very seriously in the 70s around networked local health clinics that provided community care, if those had been infrastructured really well and developed over time rather than putting, you know, dollar upon dollar into this in this insurance industry that doesn't deliver and doesn't serve publics, but, you know, closures of hospitals. Is there something in that past that might help us get through this moment with an alternative vision of what the solution is? Because right now what I'm seeing is the CDC, you know, pretty much last night on 2020 was saying, you know, where we really effed up is we decided we were going to make our own tests and we should have turned to industry. And I'm just like, I think it goes further back than that. And Thabisile, for you too, in the kinds of work that you've been doing around looking at resistance movements in the Caribbean, and you know, how in a place that is networked but also has to have both slow and fast communication, you know, is there something in the way in which people delivered goods and services to one another that maybe we can start to model, maybe if it's not something replicated and supported by the state? But I'm trying to think through, you know, are there examples from our past that are going to help us imagine a different turn here than let's just double down on industry and bulk up the market and hope that then can you know, magically solve the problems? And either one of you can go first. I know that was not the most well done question, but I'm thinking now.
So I'll start. I mean, I think if we you know, hark back to the Black Panther Party's health activism and its clinics, you know, Joan, I mean, I think certainly there have always been alternative visions. I mean, of Black people's well-being. I mean, you know, in my Black Panther book, I talk about, there's a historian, Charla Fett at Occidental, who talks about the sort of plantation slavery economy and what health meant in that context. And so for, you know, for slave owners or people who owned enslaved Africans, it meant, you know, the concept of soundness, which meant like your body just needed to be, you know, upright enough so that I could make you labor and extract labor from you. It didn't need to be healthy or fit or thriving or any of these things, right? And so very early on, you see in enslaved communities a vision of their health that is not just soundness, like, you know, like that is not just about being chattel for, you know, someone's extraction. It's really about having the kind of full, you know, a sort of full and complete life. And so those alternative visions have always been there, but you know, they're always, by the time you get to the Black Panther Party in particular, it's really engaged in you know, a particular kind of contestation with the state. So on the one hand, the Black Panther Party health clinics were imagined as a critique of the state, right? So you had coming out of the War on Poverty programs an investment in what were called community clinics, but then you had you know, people in Black communities saying this is not, you know, that we're supposed to be really kind of the community, led by the community. But you had members of the Black Panther Party saying this is not the clinic that we want. And, you know, it's being led by, you know, kind of race brokers and bureaucrats in our community, and that's not our vision for health. So on the one hand, it was an alternative vision, but then the question becomes, how does one sustain that and institutionalize that over time? And that's when the hard questions come. To institutionalize that, some of the work in the Panther case meant writing for federal grants to do, you know, that in a kind of early days of a process that would become this whole now huge kind of civil society and nonprofit sector that may not have a relationship to the state, but has a relationship to philanthropy and donors. That's fairly complicated. On the other hand, you know, so that might have been, we'll take that as a sort of Bay Area Black Panther Clinic case. If you look at a place like Chicago, you know, the city of Chicago from the very beginning wanted the Black Panther Clinic, which, you know, before Fred Hampton was murdered, was thriving and actually quite extraordinary in its sophistication, wanted them to sort of register with the public health authorities, right? So then, you know, so you had, so there are in the sort of in the archives, there are all of these, and particularly in the newspaper, all of these accounts in the Chicago Tribune and elsewhere in which you've got sort of two members of the Black Panther Party brought before a kind of local court because they don't have the kind of correct health permit to be doing the work that they're doing. And then, you know, in these instances, you had activists saying, well, this is like, the whole point is that we don't want to do that. The whole point is like not to replicate the status quo. So I think that so there's always these powerful alternative visions. You know, the challenge, I think, for all of us is really sort of how those visions then become actualized and scaled. And the sort of challenge of the success, you know, of institutionalization and success of one's work, and how to think about that, I think, in increasingly smart ways. As, you know, we have lots of examples, obviously, from the Panther era and beyond, about kind of forms of cooptation or institutionalization in which the political valence of the work is lost. So, yeah, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I know that Thabisile is going to go straight into Chicago because that is her, it's her favorite place on earth. So, but yeah, Thabisile, if you want to react to that, and then, you know, let us hear a little bit more about the research and how your research is informing your work.
Right.
Yeah.
I think this moment, well, okay, keeping in line with the longevity theme of this, the really important longevity theme of this conversation, I think it is also important to stress that Black people and all people are always thinking of alternatives and working it out in whatever context they may be in. So then my job is then to think about how the contexts have changed. So prior to industrialization, which is the era that I'm working on, of course, I do 18th century work. Just before industrialization, when people thought about alternatives to, so the way pandemics or viruses showed up during colonialism or during plantation slavery eras was because of the exploitation of the land and deforestation. It was because Europeans were bringing in crops and livestock and animals that were unfamiliar to the land and unfamiliar to the people. And it worked in ways that were both, viruses worked in ways that were both, that could have been good for Black people or bad for Black people. So John McNeil has a really good book out. It's called Mosquito Empires. And it's such a good counter history because it talks about how these two viruses in particular, yellow fever and malaria, that were carried, whose carriers were mosquitoes, they only affected Europeans on Caribbean islands. And in a sense, he said that they killed off so many French colonists in particular, like in Saint-Domingue, like in Haiti, that in a sense, these mosquitoes were revolutionary agents. They helped with the Haitian Revolution. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about when we think about COVID-19 and the countries that it has most affected because of the conditions, because of the inequities of these countries and in these nations. So if we think about it, if we look at the charts, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, they're Western countries, right? It's the U.S., it's Spain, I don't know if China would be considered quote unquote the West, but a lot of these, like the UK, exactly, Farida, a lot of these like hyper industrialized, of course, capitalist, quote unquote Western countries or provinces, and there's something to be said about that. And it's not, in essence, it's not like we can't say that COVID-19 is helping us wage war against corporations now, who would be like the contemporary people that we're fighting against to some degree. The crazy part about this time, about this context, is that the most vulnerable in these Western societies are actually dying off. So when we think about using history, but within this context, we have to keep that in mind, that it's changed. So prior to industrialization, when people were thinking about alternatives during times of pandemics and viruses, they were just talking about land. They wanted to keep land, they wanted to protect land. Maroons were talking about land. I work on a group called the Black Caribs, who were a Black indigenous group who resisted domination and colonialism and enslavement from both British and French forces for almost 2 centuries. And they were all about land. And whenever British or French planters would come to their island, to St. Vincent, to try to quote unquote develop or cultivate land, they would set fire to the plantations. So what does setting fire to capitalist plantation mean in 2020, right? Those are the questions that we have to ask. I don't know if that answered your, I know I went on a bit of a tangent with mosquitoes and the Haitian solution, but
no, it's very, very relevant. And I think that that's part of the issue is that, we want frameworks that are easy to apply, that strip us of the context so that we can more easily head towards a solution. But the solutions that keep coming up are obvious to those in power, which is a return to this profit-driven, pharmaceuticals and vaccines and testing. But that's not the whole of the issue. And I think that the conversation that we're having is explicitly about, like, how do we think about alternatives in this moment where those in power are sort of pushing us towards these, what they would consider very obvious solutions. And, to get to a different point about the conversation that we're having as well, is trying to think now through the representations of the movements, and that history isn't in the present, right? Where, people want to silo out, the movement's doing this, the pandemic's doing this, and politicians are up to this. And even in the work that we've been doing about media manipulation, the confluence of this idea that we would need to remake or reinstitutionalize or rethink health in a very broad context around community health and not just individual health, in the kinds of stuff that we're studying, like Trump and his social media teams are really trying to tie that together to Democrats wanting communism, right? Or this idea that this is ushering in socialism in the United States, because any call for something like Medicare for all or reimagining alternatives to the current moment is, in our minds, as people who study disinformation, that's a really big opportunity for politicians to push a wedge, right? And to step into the fray and say, well, look at these protesters, their views must be illegitimate because there's violence in the streets, right? Or that they are, we've seen several fires set to police stations in different cities, and the representations of what's going on in Seattle, and the troops. And then last night's police abduction of a young trans person. We're starting to see the media machine start to become the bearer of history, start to retell these stories in ways that are, it's really important for us to remember what we already know, right? And to transmit that knowledge to, I love that Thabisile started out being like, I'm an older millennial, because there are people that don't, that are younger than us that require us to transmit that knowledge, but then also for them to teach up to us and to help us understand these new issues, because, when I was interested in health movements, and particularly around mental illness and stigma, mentioning trans health just wasn't on the agenda. This is only, 10, 15 years ago, right? And trans health was something that just didn't make sense to people. And so it's been a while now that we've been trying to think through and incorporate and be much more robust in our talking points, but at the same time, the media and corporations and politicians are trying to distill a very easy to digest message that keeps the hierarchies, especially the racialized hierarchies, intact without ever making mention of it, right? I'm always inspired by the work of Eduardo Beneva Silva around this notion of colorblind racism, this idea that, or a colorblind policy, even to say that, we were even seeing it yesterday with Barr's testimony, this idea that our policies are applied equally to people and therefore cannot be construed as racist. And, our healthcare is given equally to people according to their employment status, so therefore cannot be described as racist. And so I know that we're coming to the end of our discussion portion here, but I did want to ask you just to close on, and then we're going to go into a more interactive space. And you both are welcome to stay, or I know Alondra's got a laundry list of things to do. But I want you to just kind of give me a little bit of an articulation about right now, what are we going to struggle to remember about this moment as historians? You go back in the archives and you find things and you're like, that seemed really important, and it's not in any of the history books that I'm reading. And so, in this moment, what do you think is happening that is just, under the running boards that we're not paying a ton of attention to, but is sort of at the core of some of the issues that we're going through, either in the US context or more globally? And either one of you can take it up first. Alondra, if you need to go, you could go first.
All right, maybe I'll go first. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think that what we're not hearing enough about is, and there's some wonderful comments in the chat, is this moment being connected not only to a kind of longer history, longevity of movements, but of a decade or 15 years of global social movements around inequality, around state extraction of resources from people, around, forms of state repression and injustice. And so, I think it's important to really understand this moment, in conversation with, if not sort of directly linked to, mass mobilization in Chile. I mean, you think of places in Latin America where, as the sort of story goes, the sort of state said they were going to raise the subway fare, and then there were mass protests, right? So of course it's not about the subway fare. It's really about kind of living under a system that can be so, by fiat can sort of change the conditions of your living and sort of what it means to live under, forms of kind of precarity. So I think we're missing that. And then I think to kind of hark back to the Black Panther Party, they were, a deeply mediated movement, right? And understood that they had to have their own vehicles for conveying who they were. So, by the time you get to the kind of late party years, there were records. So there were albums. There were, they were appearing on television. There were, of course, they had their own photographers. So how do you, and I think today, we would call it surveillance, right? So how do you respond to COINTELPRO, to the extent that you know about it and that you can, which was this kind of mass surveillance of the civil rights and Black Power activists, of red activists. You create your kind of own narrative and space. And this goes back to a lot of what Thabisile was saying at the beginning of the conversation about, the way that activists are using media to sort of create their own narratives about the work that they're doing, understanding that you can't rely on, on mainstream media to be, or the media machine, to use your phrase, Joan, to be sort of reliable narrators of what you're doing. And, one of the things that was clear in the research that I was doing around the health work of the Panthers in particular is that accounts of this work were clearly suppressed in the media. So, that it was, there were not attempts of the media to tell this more kind of complex and nuanced story about all of the things that the movements were doing. So I think that as we are looking back and trying to learn about this movement, it'll be important to think about, as you're suggesting, the things that are being lost and being not mentioned. And then I think the other, one thing that's important, I think, for this moment to think about as well is, of course, the work of various kind of surveillance and cameras on the work of policing that are making visible what's long been known in Black and Brown communities and queer communities and Indigenous communities, and really sort of telecasting that to the world and making visible the fact that the forms of violence that are an extrajudicial, killing that are meted out on Black and Brown communities are happening to journalists, to others as well, sort of in the full light of day. And so, there's a role in the media, that's interesting in this moment, because those who are the victims of police violence are increasingly members of the media in ways they might have not been in the past. So the media machine, I think, has a lot of moving parts right now. And then just lastly, I just want to say that it's been so great to be in conversation with both of you as I listen here to Thabisile's response.
Yeah.
Thank you. And likewise, Alondra, Dr. Nelson. It's wonderful to speak to you as well, or with you. I would say, Joan, one thing that I hope historians remember, I'm going to frame it like that because I'm an optimist forever. One thing that I would hope historians remember, and that I'll do my best and keep everybody accountable to, is just how multicultural this 2020's uprising has been. And not multicultural in an institutional sense, nor in a flat sense, but unlike if you go to the past, if you go back to the past couple of decades, we have the LA riots, we have the Watts riots in the 60s, further along. Those riots did not have, or those uprisings did not have as many different kinds of people as we see in the streets today. And that is something very, very, very important. I would say that the majority of people during these uprisings were non-Black, which is wonderful. Which is wonderful because, I don't know about the majority, but I would say a good amount. It's wonderful because if we go to history, and I'm gonna go to Chicago too, since you called me out on it. If we think about historical coalitions against state violence and for mutual aid, against state violence and for mutual aid are one and the same. They're one and the same struggle. So if we think about the Rainbow Push Coalition, which Fred Hampton helped co-found, and which had people from the Young Lords, which was the young Puerto Rican organization in Chicago. It had young white kids from the Appalachian Mountains, young white working class kids in it. And this is with Black Panthers. Everybody was organizing together within the Rainbow Push Coalition, right? And the Rainbow Push was so dangerous that COINTELPRO had infiltrators into that organization within the first year of its development. We could take it back even further to Bacon's Rebellion, you know, when we had both white and Black indentured servants aligning with enslaved Black people in Virginia for a common cause. And that coalition was so dangerous that they burned down Jamestown, and the state of Virginia immediately upped the laws on making slavery hereditary for Black people. These types of multiracial coalitions are key. And I think, if anything, I would want people to definitely remember that. They're not just key, but they're incredibly necessary. A widespread of people uniting under one objective. I know that sounds really cliche, but it's really as simple as that.
No, I think I agree with you, you know, just because, and Farida is definitely calling my attention to this in the media, you know, depending upon where your entry point is, the visual aspects, the representation of who protesters are part of the stakes, right? And I watch too much right-wing media, and in it, there's this bouncing back and forth between, you know, BLM as this kind of organization, and there are just kind of like crowds of folks, right? But there's no individuals that they're lifting up or representing the movement in those spaces. And then on the left-wing media that I watch, representations of the movements tend to be flattened, and then movements are often represented by journalists or politicians, and not necessarily the key figures in different cities. And they're not getting at that nuance. But I always, you know, when I look at the visual aspects of movements, I look at, you know, what are people writing on their signs, and, you know, how much effort are they putting into those signs? Like, some of them it's a lot. So I do want to give you guys a chance to bail if you want. We're going to transition into part 2 of this training, where we're going to talk a bit more in depthly about media manipulation and disinformation. And I want to say so much thanks. I hope you are able to stick around and keep up with the talk. But otherwise, like, both of you continue to inspire me, and it's definitely the best part of my week, is being able to talk to you about these things and others. So keep on doing it. You know?
And thank you for the work that you do, Joan. It's so incredibly necessary. Like, I don't think people even realize that we have somebody pushing back against, or somebody in an organization pushing back against all this misinformation, because people will read anything and believe it, and it'll animate their entire lives, what they read on social media and on the internet. So just to know that you're behind regulating that
we're trying.
It helps me sleep at night.
Well, you come visit. We'll steer it up.